All right, give me some cover.
Television brought the brutality of the war into the comfort of the living room. Vietnam was lost in the living rooms of America, not the battlefields of Vietnam. Marshall McLuhan, 16th of May, 1975. The day is November 1st, 1955. President Eisenhower sent 700 military advisors, also known as MAAG, to train the South Vietnamese under the Southeast Asia Organization, also known as SEATO. This was meant to train Vietnamese people to fight for democracy against the Vietnamese Communist Party, later referred as the Viet Cong. Over the next 10 years, U.S. officials sent another 25,000 U.S. advisors to Vietnam. The U.S. government hoped that by arming and defending Vietnamese people, they would realize the superiority of democracy and the freedoms of the West. However, there was a split between Ho Chi Minh supporters and U.S. imperialism. In 1965, the first round of U.S. soldiers was sent to Vietnam with around 2,600 soldiers, which only furthered commitment by the U.S. government. It was an official declaration of war. 2 years of war and hardship from Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong left many U.S. soldiers and citizens uneasy of the war. The result of this is seen on April 15th, 1967. One of the first public speeches about the horrors of Vietnam was spoken by Martin Luther King Jr. in the presence of 400,000 protesters while they marched to the Capitol when Martin Luther King gives his speech, Beyond Vietnam.
Come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. I join you in this meeting because I'm in deepest agreement with the aims and work of the organization which has brought us together, clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam.
20th of January 1968, also known as Tet, a Vietnamese holiday, during which a ceasefire was arranged for 36 hours. However, Ho Chi Minh launched a series of coordinated attacks on 50 to 60 POIs, including cities like Saigon and Hue. These 3 months of attacks lost the lives of 2,600 U.S. soldiers, with 10,000 wounded. These attacks were futile in changing the battlefield of Vietnam, but it sent a message.
Will be well when the day is done, and if you take my hand, my son, all will be well when the day is done. Day is done. Sing it to me now. Day is done. Wanna hear you now. Day is done. Sing it to me now. Day is a little louder. Sing it out now. And if you take my hand, my son, all will be well when the day is done.
Protests were rampant in the years following and until the end of the Vietnam War. But with these ongoing protests of the Vietnam War, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced he would no longer be a nominee in the next election. He did this because of the backlash of the American people for how he handled the Vietnam War.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The resignation of President Lyndon B. Johnson was not a surprise to the American people. With this news, Richard Nixon inserted himself into relevancy once again after being vice president for President Eisenhower. Richard Nixon won the election and was inaugurated for president in 1969. He had seen the mistakes of the former president and wanted to end the Vietnam War. He did this by increasing involvement in Vietnam, by increasing the amount of soldiers sent to Vietnam. He had sent over 1.8 million soldiers over the course of his presidency. Protests only grew and were not stopping. To understand how these protests evolved, we need to go back to 1967. This was the year that the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, aka VVAW, was established. This group has been very active in protests about Vietnam. This group started to pick up pace protesting in 1971. This group of soldiers protested for 3 days straight. On April 21st, 50 veterans marched to the Capitol and turned themselves in as war criminals to protest the Vietnam War. This was their way of showing that they were utterly disgusted by the actions in the war. 2 days later, a group of 800 Vietnam vets went to the White House and threw their medals of honor and ribbons at the steps. They did this to symbolize their hatred of the war. Richard Nixon heard the outcry of the people, so in early 1972 he confirmed suspicions. He withdrew most of U.S. soldiers. He kept around 25 to 30,000 soldiers. However, he had sent over 1,000 airstrikes on North Vietnam over the course of the next week, the biggest amount since 1968. The people of America were not happy with the broken promises of Richard Nixon. The people started demanding Richard Nixon's resignation. 1 year later, on January 27th of 1973, Richard Nixon signed the Paris Peace Accords. This was a peace treaty signed to end the Vietnam War. Vietnamese government promised to give all of the U.S. prisoners of war and to have a ceasefire. In return for the U.S. to take all U.S. advisors out of Vietnam, around 2,400, and dismantle all U.S. bases in 60 days. 1 more year later, Richard Nixon stated he would not run again for presidency in the following election. He had stated the reasons of this to be previous failures in Vietnam and the Watergate scandal.
I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Monument was erected. This monument means much to many. Maybe it means something to you, but this monument stands tall. This is not only to the memorial of the fallen families and people ruined by Vietnam, but it's a reminder that the people of America have power and can alter the course of history.